welcome everyone to this webinar, Fruto's webinar. I'm Mariana Morris. I run Fruto Studio, and with me I've got a couple of colleagues, Carmen, who is going to help. She's one of our UX designers. She's going to help with the Q&A at the end, just asking me the questions. Dave, my other colleague, UX designer, is also on the call, but he's in the background at the moment. Great. So before I start, I want to introduce you to Fruto, just for you to have a bit of a background of the type of work that we do. So when you're talking about user research, for example, you know what type of projects that you work with. So we are a consultancy, a studio based in Oxford. We also provide some training, in-house training, and some public ones. We work with a variety of sectors, but the main sectors that we work with that are coming up very often is healthcare, publishing, and education. So we're building a strong track record with those. And we provide, user experience and user interface design for web, mobile, and emerging technologies. We work very much like an extension of the team, so of our clients' team. So very often, more often than not, they have a development team. Sometimes they have designers in-house, and we come in as these, extra pair of eyes, or sometimes is like extra capacity or extra specialism to work with them. It's also useful to say that we are a remote team. We are all based in the UK, but mostly in Oxford. But we are predominantly remote, and we meet when we can, and when we want. So typically for workshops and so on. We haven't been meeting each other in person for a while because of the current situation. But we have built, in the past 3 years, we have tested several tools for remote working, improved our processes massively. So that's the type of things that I want to share with you. So we work with, early stage startups up to, large organizations. So there is quite a mix there in terms of kind of type of clients that you work with. And I want to show you 3 very quick case studies that are on our website, which are specifically related to user research. So we've run a large discovery phase for doctors.net.uk, which is the UK's largest network of doctors. They have around over 200,000 doctors on their website. And this is about, 90% of the doctors register on their site. And what you did for them was what I'm going to show to you in this webinar. So we run some, user interviews with about 15 to 20 doctors. Then we prototyped something, and we did some UI design in another phase, and then run some usability tests as well. The same with our websites that we recently redesigned, which was the Microbit Educational Foundation website. So if you don't know Microbit, it's this small programming device that was promoted and distributed by the BBC in 2016. And they have a website to promote, to help teachers find resources and be comfortable teaching programming languages. So that's what we worked with them on the redesign, the recent redesign of their website. And we work as well with a very early stage startups such as ClassList, which is a communication tool between teachers, between parents. And we worked with them to understand what the problems were with their user groups. And they knew what was going on in terms of, one user group was not happy, or frustrated with the experience. And then we come in to understand in depth why that was happening and how to prioritize the UX tasks. So this webinar is about running remote user research. I will talk a little bit about, give an introduction of user research in terms of preparing, recruiting, and conducting. And I'll then talk specifically about being remote. So the pros and cons of remote research, and specifically about two techniques that you run very often, which are user interviews and usability tests. At the end, we're going to have a Q&A. So if throughout the workshop, the webinar, you have any questions, please feel free to add to the Q&A part of Zoom. And then at the end, we're going to address them. If you don't have time to address all of them, I can get back to you by email and continue the conversation then. And just as an introduction, so I'm the founder and director at Fruto, which is a user experience design studio in Oxford. And I've been doing design for websites and digital for the past 17 years. I also co-founded UX Oxford. So if you are not aware of UX Oxford, I really recommend you to check it out. It's a free monthly event that is currently remote, so online talks. Great, so let's get on and let's talk a little bit about user research. So the benefits of user research are to create a great user experience. So you need to have a deep understanding of user needs, expectations, and goals, and their journeys and what they are trying to achieve in order to create a great experience, a great design. And these needs to be embedded in the process. It not only come at the end. And the reason why we run this process of user experience design is to decrease the risk and costs of building something users want to value or use. It's much more expensive to build something than to run like a user research study at the start. And also to use the benefit of user research is to find business and innovative opportunities. So if you know what the current situation is, if you know the user journeys or their mental models, you know where exactly you can identify the pain points and improve on those. And that's what is going to increase retention, increase users number of users who want to use your product on a regular basis. There are several UX techniques, user research techniques. These are just a snapshot of some. There are qualitative and quantitative types of techniques. So qualitative is when you get a small number of users and you hear them in kind of, you work with them to understand the in-depth insights, whereas with the quantitative research, you get numbers. So very often you can think about these two as quantitative. In quantitative research, you understand what's going on, whereas with qualitative research, you understand why that is happening. And then you also have techniques that you hear what people say and hear and observe what people do. So these are some of the techniques, and I want to talk specifically about user interviews and usability tests. So user interviews are these one-to-one sessions where you ask questions to users and you get their opinions, or not their opinions, but their views, and understand how they work and so on. And usability tests is when you observe them interacting with your product. We often need to do a discovery phase at the start of the project, and that's when we do some user interviews and do a holistic evaluation of the project. And when you're thinking about doing an iterative process such as Agile, for example, you have these mini cycles of improvements, and that's when you do a technique such as usability test. I mean, I'm going to focus on usability tests and user interviews, but it could be other techniques there as well. So for example, if you're working on the navigation of the website, you might be doing card sorting and so on. So very, very simply, this is how our process is when you're starting a project, or when you're about to do a UX design process. We identify the user groups, run some user interviews to understand them in depth, summarize the interviews into personas, map out their expected user journeys or their mental models or their current user journeys. Then you go into the design phase, which is map out the page flow of the system, create a prototype, and run tests. This is a very linear process. It looks like a very linear process, but when you talk about prototype and usability tests, it's a series of iterations and it's a cycle there. So prototype, test, or build test. So it depends on the project. In terms of preparing, we first identify the user groups. And at the beginning of the project, these are assumptions very often. So because you're actually going to have more in-depth insights when you start running the interviews, and you then I think, okay, actually, these users that I thought belonged to these user groups here actually have other needs that I didn't realize, and then belongs to these others. So we kind of create subgroups and so on after the initial user interviews. We write down the key objectives. So any user research needs to have some objectives, because you need to be very clear on what you're trying to learn in those sessions, right? So, for example, if the objectives are clear enough, you could go to a user research without your script and still be able to run it. This is if it's a very clear, focused research. So it's really important to have these objectives. And then after that, you recruit representatives of each of the user groups. And when you're preparing, you're creating a script as well. So we usually have an introduction. So this is to make the participants comfortable with that session. You let them know how long the session will take. If it's a usability test, you might want to tell them that if there is any problems, it's not them, it's the website. And there is a bit on that. And then you write the script in terms of questions, and these questions should serve you as prompts. So it's not a questionnaire. You're not creating a survey where you go through each question and just tick a box. Once you make a conversational style when it's user interviews, so the questions are there to prompt you, to remind you what you were trying to ask them. If it's a usability test, in that script, you're going to write scenarios and tasks. And then there are some follow-up questions that you can add at the end of the session, especially if you think that a question might lead them or prime them to think in a certain way. Leave that at the end as well. In terms of recruiting users, so typically we run, we recruit 5 to 7 users per user group for a study. I'm very keen that we do a series of studies rather than one very large study at the beginning. So typically our clients recruit users because they're already in contact with them. They already have customers or not, but they already have they're very much in contact with the market. But if this is not your case, if you're working in internal teams, find the internal teams that are already in contact with users. So very often it's like support, sales, and so on, and try to see how you can get access to them. Now, in certain industries, it can be really hard to get access to users. So there is you could, for example, get in touch with organizations such as charities to help you promote the research, and see if we can get users in that way. Or I heard from some of our clients that participated in events where users were and did guerrilla testing there. So, for example, have a stand at a medical event, for example, and attract users in that way, and then go into an area and run some usability tests or some interviews there with them. If you're doing remote, so if the event is really tricky at this time, so we need to be creative with social media. So, you know, are your users on Facebook, for example? Are your users on LinkedIn? Or try to get their attention in this way to help recruit. But if recruiting, you know, takes you a lot of time and it becomes really hard, then there are some user recruitment agencies, such as, you know, People for Research. There are several ones. They are expensive, and the more specialized you want the users to be, the more expensive it is. Or, you know, if you think about maybe advertising on the local community newspaper or whatever it is, then you can find users that way. It's important that you hire or recruit a diverse set of users, and think about whatever is relevant to your project, right? So things like geographical location, technical ability, level of seniority in the roles, if you're talking about, you know, workers, for example, familiarity with your product, age range, gender, whatever is relevant to your product. And it's really important that you don't only focus on the majority of users, right? Because it's very easy to design something for the best case scenario. You need to make sure that you get the diversity to allow for, you know, for the non-typical user as such, if you think this way. So when we are thinking about the user groups, one way that we found useful to do would be to create buckets. So on this one, we're working with a publishing house, for example, when you wanted to talk with these different types of users, so owners, you know, strategists, analysts, managers, frontline, for example. And then we wanted a cross section of these other demographics. So typically we put the demographics on one in one list, and then you have the user groups, and you kind of just get a cross section of those to make sure that you are taking into account the diverse set. Scheduling can be very time consuming. So one thing that I recommend is to use a tool such as Calendly. For example, there are several other tools. You don't need to use this one. So the challenge with scheduling is that there are different, you know, time zones when you're working with a product that is you know, worldwide, for example, and you know, the managing of scheduling, rescheduling, canceling, you know. So if you use, this has, you know, massively improved our efficiency. When you use Calendly, you send a link to users, for example, and they go there, they allocate the time that you are available and book their time. And the tool also integrates with something like Zoom or GoToMeeting, for example. So at the time that they book, it generates a link to their session, and it adds that session into your calendar. If you're using Google Calendar, I think is with Microsoft as well. So these can make your process much more efficient. In terms of conducting user research, there are three main things to think about. One of them is to ask open questions. Very often in our day-to-day conversations, we're asking closed questions all the time. So open-ended questions are questions that allow someone to give a free-form answer. And closed-ended questions can be answered as a yes or no, or they have a limited set of possible answers, such as, you know, do you prefer A or B? This is a closed question. And if the user prefers C, you never know, right? So if you ask an open-ended questions, could be, what do you prefer? So the most important benefit of open-ended questions is that they allow you to find more than you anticipate. People may share motivations that you didn't expect and mention behaviors and concerns that you knew nothing about. When you ask people to explain things to you, they often reveal surprising mental models, problem-solving strategies, hopes, fears, and much more. So it's really important to ask open-ended questions. Also, another point is to avoid leading questions. So a leading question is when the answer or the desired outcome is hinted in the question. And honesty and unbiased participation feedback is critical for user research. So an example of leading question is, I saw that you're having difficulty with the navigation. What happened? So we're assuming that they had difficulty. A better way of asking that would be, what was easy or difficult about getting the content you wanted? Another question that I see very often in surveys is, did you find the website easy to use? That's so leading. We can ask, how was your experience using the website? Another question that I see very often is people asking, did you like it? Do you like my product? Do you like this thing? This is very leading again. So how was your experience? Or find a way to ask that question better. That question of, would you buy this, right? Forget that, because it's very kind of common for users to answer, yeah, I would. But it doesn't mean anything. They might not buy it. So the best thing to do is to create something and test it and see if people are actually going to buy it. And this something can be a minimum viable product, or can be adding a little kind of purchase icon on our website, for example, or something. But avoid these leading questions that is going to mislead your research. And the third point that's really important is active listen. So you're there as the facilitator of the session. You actively listen, observe, and prompt. So prompts are things like, describe what you're looking at, tell me more about, what do you understand by? And then if they say something that you don't quite understand, you can always ask, what do you mean by? Or we want to clarify something, what else can you tell me about? Two techniques that I find very useful are the echoing technique. So for example, if they say, this page is confusing, you can just repeat what they said or the last word, and they will continue the story. So this is specifically useful if someone kind of stops talking. And you're there to, try to get them to talk and share their thoughts. So the echo technique is helpful. And the paraphrase and summarize technique can show to the user that you're listening, that you're there with them, which encourages them to say more. So the aim of the user research is to learn and to find the areas of improvement or opportunities, and to learn what your the needs of your users, right? Now, I see several problems when people are starting out with user research, when they try to validate how good their idea or design is. It's not for that. You're there to learn and not to validate, or validate how good your design skills are, or get answers of solutions from users, or solutions of features. This is not what user research is for. We are there to learn. So when you're talking about specifically remote research, I'll talk a little bit about the user interviews and usability tests and some tools that you use for that. So the pros of being remote, is that it's comfortable for users. So users are in their natural environment when you're running this remote research. They're using their own devices in their own rooms. They don't need to travel, and sometimes going to a different place can be daunting or difficult for some users. And another very kind of big pro is that it's cost effective when running sessions with users in multiple geographical locations, right? So these are the two main reasons why very often we run remote user research rather than in-person research, even when we can. So more often than not, we run remote. But there are some cons, and there are some things that you need to be aware of to kind of overcome that, or try our best to not have these problems. So one of them is that it can be harder to create rapport with users. And for a good user research, they need to be comfortable with the session. So with that, we, if you can run sessions with video calls, for example, is so much easier. And then you might want to have like a more extensive introduction, maybe, depending on how the type of users. If they're very busy, that can be a problem, but the aim is to create that, make them comfortable in that session. And it can be harder for less tech-savvy users. So if their technical abilities are not very high, I mean, it's very easy to forget that because we are in front of our computers all the time, but it's not the case for many users, many user types. So we need to find a way around that. So for example, if you're running user interviews, maybe it's just a phone call that you need to have with them, and forget about the videos and recording and so on. Users might also not be able to download the software necessary to share their screen because of firewall. Or they might not be very tech-savvy to download software. So I'm talking specifically about, usability tests that you want them to share their screen while you observe them interacting with the product. Then this is specifically in places like schools and hospitals. You might have a problem with firewall. So how to overcome that, or are there any tools that they are already using that you can then use instead? We are very flexible with the tools that you use, especially for that. And also, not very tech savvy people to download the tool. So for example, if you're using some tools on their phone, if you're doing a usability test and you want them to share their screen of their phone, they need to download the app, and that can be tricky because one, they might not be comfortable doing that. They might think their phones might not have enough space, for example, for another app. And how do you overcome that? That's the tricky part. And also, when you're running a remote session, it can be harder to understand users' environment. Particularly if it's for a hardware design. For example, we recently worked on a project that is a device, a physical medical device. And what we did was, using FaceTime, so users could show to us their environment. So specifically for user interviews, these are one-to-one sessions, from 30 minutes to 6 minutes usually. They are semi-structured, so they're in a conversation style, but you have a script. And usually, it's one facilitator if the user, and then you have people observing, clients or people in the team observing on mute session. It's really important that it's a one-to-one session. And then you can record sessions as well, which we do very often. In terms of note-taking, we tend to take very few notes, as in the facilitators take notes as part of that conversation, but to record the sessions in case we need to go back to specific areas of the session. And the user interviews can be face-to-face or remote, and we're going to talk about specifically about remote here. In terms of the user interviews, the main aim is to understand current behaviors and context of users, their existing behavior, because they don't have your solution or your new solution, their pain points with the current systems they use. And this is not only about your product. You want to understand, if, for example, they go onto another system to, do something, or they go to Excel and create a spreadsheet and then go into your product. You want to understand all these interactions with other systems and other people and so on. So you kind of step back a little bit more to understand their key pain points, because you might solve something essential to them there. Goals and expectations. So what are they trying to accomplish? Everyone who is access the system, they have a task in mind to accomplish. They are trying to achieve something, and that's what you need to have in mind all the way to make a streamlined experience. So the tools, as I was saying, very often is for moderated user interviews are always like moderated. So you can have you can use a video call such as Zoom, GoToMeeting, Microsoft Teams, Google Meet, or whatever it is, FaceTime, as I mentioned that example. There are tools that are specifically for user research, such as Lookback. And with tools like that, and also GoToMeeting has a bit of that as well, where when you're recording the session and when you're taking notes, it takes notes kind of in line with the recording. So if you need to go back to your notes, you know where to find that recording, which can be really helpful when you work with a tool that's specifically for user research. And phone, as I said, sometimes we need to call users and kind of use a low-tech tool for that, because that's how we can have access to them. Our approach is that we adapt to users, right? We adapt our tools to users. So depending on the situation, we might do whatever is necessary. And also if they have only 15 minutes, yeah, we'll take that, because there are user types that are so busy that, we wouldn't be able to interview them otherwise. And then we just prioritize what we need to ask them. And then things to consider, as I said, the local tech ability of users, privacy. So very often when you're running either interviews or usability tests, for example, they are sharing their screen, you're recording their screen, and sometimes they open up their emails, or there is a notification that is private that appears on the screen. So this, you can make them aware in the introduction that they are going to share their screen, they're recording. I mean, you have to make them aware, but also make them aware that please, kind of stop the notifications, or don't open emails or anything that you don't want us to see. Don't put on your screen. And also firewall, as I said, particularly schools and hospitals in our experience. In terms of usability tests, they are also one-to-one sessions, 30 to 60 minutes. We use the method of think aloud. So we give a scenario to users, or ask them to complete certain tasks and ask them to think aloud as they try to accomplish. And you're there just to facilitate that. So if they go quiet, you might prompt them to, okay, what are you thinking, what you're trying to do, and so on. So this can be a face-to-face or remote, and moderated or unmoderated. Moderated is when you are there with the user asking them questions. Unmoderated is when you send a link to them, ask them to complete certain tasks, and then record. Usually is recording. They record themselves. And there are several websites that facilitate that. So just, very similar to user interviews in terms of the video call apps. We ask them to share their screen, or something like Lookback that was done for user research. With unmoderated, there are several tools that you can use. We don't do much unmoderated testing at all. There are some problems with that. So when you use tools like websites for unmoderated tests, so you upload a link and your script or tasks to the website. These users that go through the tasks, they can be professional users. So they get paid for that. So they can become really, really tech savvy. Meaning that, the results that you get might not be realistic for your user type. So, and also another problem with that is that you're not there to prompt them. If they say something and you don't quite understand, or if they say something that is ambiguous, or you're not there with them. So we avoid the unmoderated ones when we can, but sometimes in some certain situations can be super helpful. And we tend to do the moderated more often than not. One thing to consider when you're running usability tests is in regards to kind of, if it's easy, when you're choosing a tool, if it's easy to record and if it's easy for them to share their screen. So as I said, if the tool requires them to download something, this can be a blocker for some users. It's not a blocker for most users that we interview. We do a lot of B2B applications, but if it's a B2C application, it might be a problem. And also notes taking, as I said, if you use a tool that facilitates that kind of notes taking, and it's in line with the recording, that can be very helpful. So when you're doing running the sessions, we always encourage the team, either our clients or their internal teams or the development team and so on, to observe the sessions. And there are, you can be creative or use whatever tool you find most comfortable to collect this feedback. One tool that you find, we love is Trello. And this is one example, what you're seeing on the screen is an example of a project that we were gathering user feedback. I was running user research, for example. The team was getting some feedback from the support, ticketing software, Hotjar, and so on. So we're kind of collecting all these pieces of data. And what we did on this project was we're kind of improving the onboarding experience. So we have the steps, and you can see that there were screenshots for each of these steps. What the stats of that funnel was. So for example, if users were dropping out at a certain step, we would add there the numbers, as in 60% dropped out here and so on. And then the team were adding cards of problems that were evidence-based, or if they were not evidence-based, they were not a problems, they were assumptions or questions that you need to bring to user research, and also possible solutions that is inevitable that the team is going to have their minds bubbling with solutions. So we just collect them there and park the solutions for now, but it's useful to get them on board and get them participating in the sessions. But you don't need to use Trello. You can use other ways, like for example, on a recent project we used Miro, because part of the collection of the feedback was a workshop as well with the team, was a remote workshop with the team. So you're using Miro to collect those pieces of feedback. Other than that, we might use something like Google Docs or Google Sheets, for example, for collecting the feedback, and it's really important to involve others on that as well. Great. So I think it's a good time to stop here and ask, and hear some questions. So if you have any questions, go on Zoom and ask your questions, and Carmen will go through it and and ask them to me. And also we are building this kind of knowledge base on our website that we will have, downloadable resources. There are already some guidances there. And we're going to, in the next week or so, we're going to be building this knowledge base. So if you are interested, feel free to go to our blog and get our templates and stuff there. But it's great. I'm looking forward to hear your questions.
Great. So we have 2 questions about incentives. So let's have a look at the first one. So this is from Caterina Santos, and she says, "Hello everyone, and thank the team for the webinar. My name is Caterina, GP with special interest in UX design, Oxford. Regarding the recruiting interviewees, sometimes we may consider to give some incentive to appeal people to participate. Do you usually give incentive? What could that be in a remote, what could that be in a remote setting?"
Yeah, that's a good question. So usually we do, and we encourage our clients to do. So it's not us who would give the incentive, but our clients, because we work with them. So the incentive that we usually recommend is, an Amazon voucher, for example, of £30 or something. And that's a voucher is usually very well received, rather than money, but depending on the client. But some of our clients can get, users who are so kind of motivated to get that product to work well that they don't need to give incentives at all. So it's a mixture of like clients who prefer to give incentives and clients who prefer to not.
Great. And then we have another question related to incentives. So can you talk a little about incentives for participants, not only consumers, but employees or professionals, like for example, doctors? So would we do the Amazon voucher for them again as well?
Yeah, that's a good question, and is a tricky one, because when you talk about people who are in high paid jobs, how do you incentivize them? Is a £30 Amazon voucher be good enough? And so this reminds me of one of our clients. They wanted to get doctors to participate. So what they did was they went into an event, have a stand there, and they had these, so they were very creative. They had these kind of ducks, like these bath ducks. That was a doctor bath duck. And they were saying, if you talk to us for 20 minutes or whatever, you get a duck. And they got a lot of people. So this was a good story. So we need to be, creative. So another client, for example, they were mentioning that they were giving free something on their, so because it was a website where they could get some incentives on the website. So let's say a free subscription, for example, for them for 3 months or whatever. So whatever you are offering them and they have to pay for it, you could give that as an incentive, or a free of part of your product or service. But for employees, I think if it's employees, I would suggest that you could do a survey, and see what incentives would be useful, good for them. Sometimes a piece of cake is enough, right? Who doesn't like? But or other kind of like pizzas or whatever it is. So even when you're in remote sessions, we, for example, run a meeting where each of us received a slice of cake at home. So we can still do these things, simulate the office environment where you go for a coffee. So another meeting that we had, we received like coffee at home, ground coffee at home, for us to do that special coffee and then discuss in a meeting and have other things. The meeting was not only about discussing coffee, but so you can simulate that, in remote situations as well.
Great. So let's close these. So the next one is from Emma, and she asks, how important is it to ask some leading questions and when?
So I can't think of a situation when asking a leading question is useful. So we need to avoid leading questions as much as we can. But it's because of our bias and, that you can be aware of, but it's impossible to remove all bias in user research. Some of our questions, or the way we ask them, or when you ask them and so on, might be leading, inevitably might lead the user in a certain way, or even where they are and how your body language and so on. So I would say you shouldn't ask leading questions, try maximum as you can to remove any bias or anything that's going to prime the user in a certain way.
Great. So let's close that one. The next question we have is from Olivia, and she asks, so hello all, thank you so much for the webinar. It's been super, super useful. I am currently in the process of setting up a UX as part of our service at our company. And I am wondering which companies you would recommend for finding groups of participants for user research. We're running some internal projects and are struggling to find testing participants who accurately fit the target group for our projects. Thank you.
Yeah, so one that I'm mostly aware of is the people who are for research. You could ask them. Other than that, I don't know of any. I've used them before and a long time ago, but I haven't. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't used others to recommend. But if you want to have a call later, and if I understand more about your user groups, it might I'll be able to give you some ideas on where to find them. But yeah, on offline, if you want to get in contact with me, feel free to, and then have a chat, I think, and I can help, try to help.
Great. So our next question is from Bex, asking, do you think there may be an increase in tech ability for people after the use of online communications like FaceTime/Zoom during lockdown? Do you think there is a way we can use that in our remote user research?
Yeah, I think to a certain extent, I think so. Because they have, a lot of people have to be in contact with their families, and using something like Zoom or FaceTime is the only way they can do it. So they might be a bit more familiar for sure. So if they are, then use the tools that they're using. That with Zoom, we just need to be aware of the privacy problems that they've been having. I don't know where they are with that, but yeah. So I think to a certain extent, yes. But when you think about more, like remote communities, for example, that is probably still a problem. And then you can, for example, ask them to have their, like, let's say, someone from their family who is more tech savvy with them, just to set that up. And then you run the sessions with them. So this is a way around it. But yeah, definitely try to use, ask them what they use or what they're familiar with, and try to use the tools they're using. And there is no problem about using one tool with one user, another tool with another one, and so on,
Great. So the next one is from Peter, and he's asking, how do you overcome challenges of global audiences to ensure diversity? So for example, expectations, language, etc.
So I try to anticipate what this diversity kind of set looks like, as in, okay, so, so with languages, it can be a tricky one. You can get a interpreter, for example. I haven't had a situation where we had to hire an interpreter for that specific situation. One thing to bear in mind is when you're talking about global audiences, if it's a B2B application, for example, you might find out that the cultural differences dealing with that application or dealing with that specific organization there aren't many differences in terms of company culture. That's what I'm trying to say. So this is one find that you had when you're working with a pharmaceutical organization that were, in different geographic locations, like, America, Asia, Europe, and so on. And we interviewed people from these different locations. And one of the things was there will be different needs based on their locations. But the company culture was so kind of so strong that the differences weren't there in terms of their needs for that specific, goal or product. So just something to bear in mind. So I think the main tricky thing that I can see in this question is the language part. But in terms of expectations and so on, we just tend to get a set of groups that are in different geographic locations, and remote work is remote sessions are the best thing for that, because it's easy to get access to them. I hope this answers, but feel free to send me an email afterwards.
Great. So we have another one from Peter, and he asks, how much attention do you pay to nonverbal feedback in remote sessions, and how important do you think it is?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we do pay attention when you're doing a remote session. We do pay attention if they, for example, hesitate, or they give you some clues of dissatisfaction or happiness and so on. And when it's important to be aware of their body language and be aware of their facial expressions for you to drill down and, you know, and ask more in-depth questions. But it is, I wouldn't go into any of the techniques of kind of, you know, behavioral, as in terms of non-verbal feedback, just because there is so much kind of rules or things that are not really accurate, you know, and then, oh, if the person does this, then it means that, or there is a lot of rubbish out there. So just be aware of that. But we do pay attention on how they're speaking, and yeah, and drill down if we think that what they are saying doesn't match what their body language is kind of showing to us, and then we might prompt them to say a little bit more about something.
Great. And then we have one last question from Katarina again, and she asks, do you usually do prior triage of the potential users to interview through surveys or other methods, or you usually set up interviews with whoever the client brings?
Yeah, so we do do some kind of pilots. One is internally. We run our scripts internally just to check if any questions are not understandable for some reason or something. And then we then go straight into user research often. But the first user that we interview, we tend to ask it to be like a user that is, you know, that's maybe more friendly or you know, is less pressures in terms of, if there is less pressures in terms of time. If, for example, if someone is really senior and very busy and need to be, you know, have only 20 minutes, we might leave this user for later on, and then do some, you know, sessions with some users that you can, if there is any iterations in the script after the first one, we can do that, you know. So that's how we tend to do it. In terms of service, yeah, we have run some service before to understand their demographics a little bit more, or to understand their perceptions about the products a bit more, but it's not going to be necessarily the same users. It's just trying to get us some indication of who to interview, for example, or indication of kind of areas of the product that you need to add in the script, and it just gives us an indication to start with. But yeah, we have done service before. I know that's a bit broad, my answer, but if you want to send me an email with more specifics, I'm more than happy to answer.
Great, and that's all questions for now.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for attending. And again, if you have any further questions, or if you want to know more about, you know, how we do user research and so on, feel free to go to our blog, and next week or so we're going to be populating there with templates and things. But yeah, it was a pleasure. So thank you very much for attending. Bye.